Thank you very much to the organizers and to all participants for a really wonderful conference. I'm trying to engage you for the last half hour here. And I want to speak broadly about LENR research at MIT, specifically towards what we call and anticipate as a phase change in LENR research generally. And Jonah, my colleague, has already introduced our team, so I speak on behalf of our whole team. And our vision and outlook is really the vision of nucleonics, namely the precise control of nuclear states and reactions. And this goes beyond reactors per se. We envision that in the future there will be small-scale controlled release of nuclear energy in compact integrated devices. That's what we strive to accomplish with our work. And to get there will require an accumulation of knowledge, really, similar to what happened in the semiconductor field during the 40s and 60s. So this means many tens of thousands of person years, much more than what this community as a seed of this kind of research can accomplish. So what is needed to unleash such resources? And I've often referred back to this transistor and semiconductor development case, where here you see on the upper chart the number of publications semiconductor related, and you see sort of this trickle in the 20s and 30s, and then with the 1948 physical review letter by Bell Lab scientists, you see this big takeoff of publications of activity, of influx of resources and researchers, and then a couple of years later you see the uptake of transistor sales. And if we look at experimental LENR publications, there's about 1,000 of them that can be extracted from the LENR Canner archive. We see that kind of trend, and so what we anticipate is that there will be a moment where there will be a similar uptake as happened after 1948 with semiconductor research. And the big question is this phase change. What can cause it? How can we drive towards it? And why hasn't there been such a phase change to date? Our answer is because there is still no consensus on the existence of LENR effects and their significance from the perspective of the science and funding community at large. That's why, as Dave Nagel said earlier, we're looking at millions of dollars and not at billions of dollars of investments and public funding here. And I think to remedy this, we need to listen to good faith critics' answers to the question, what would it take for you to take this literature and these claims seriously? There are, of course, bad faith critics, which I think can be rightly ignored, but there are also good faith critics. And I'm showing here Julian Schwinger, who wrote about cold fusion, neither a true believer nor a disbeliever be. And he's here right next to Kurt Gödel, who's a mentor of my mentor who brought me into the cold fusion research community. So what have we learned from listening to good faith critics? I think it's clear that this is a different time than the 1990s. Clearly, a lot of research has been treated unfairly in the 1990s, but people today there's a greater openness, and people want to know more about this field and this research, and they're open to sensible results and arguments, but we need to provide them. And we need to answer the right kinds of questions. We need to get the right kinds of results and present them in the right kinds of ways. And so I will step through a couple of steps that we identified as being crucial in that regard. And I refer to these as contextualize, explain, curate, and upgrade. So what do I mean by contextualize? Well, this is where our work tries to establish context for the kind of systems and the kind of relevant knowledge that in the context of LENR experiments and corresponding theory. And so, for instance, in this animation, we've sort of made the comparison to how electronics is all about controlling the atomic states, the electronic orbitals. But then what we are looking at in the context of LENR is actually we're looking at the nuclear states and the waveforms of the nuclear states and the way they can change their shape, their form, their energy state, and how that is susceptible, not so different in principle to how electronic states can be changed through their environment. And then we also have worked on a number of animations which are really kind of live literature reviews. This, for instance, here that shows the diffusion of hydrogen and also vacancy migration in a lattice based on the physical principles and the literature. That involved about 30 different papers, not from the LENR community, but from simply from the metal hydrogen community, and describes the kind of relevant steps and literature in terms of how hydrogen molecules dissociate at the surface of palladium, in this case as a model system, and then get absorbed and diffuse. And so it's this kind of work to conceptualize that we think is important for people outside the field to be aware of what is the context here even. And then we need to explain the variety of conditions and outcomes, which is often puzzling to people. And here I particularly refer to the variety of reported outcomes involving nuclear particle emission. I just give here some examples of papers that reported those, like the Uchikoshi paper reporting neutron bursts, light element formation, and excess heat. And I'm aware there are other observables that have been reported, but I would like to here focus on those three. And 90% of these 1,000 experimental reports on LENR do report or claim anomalies of at least one of those three types. So how to make sense of such different observables? And here I can refer to our New Journal of Physics paper and Peter Hagelstein's work more broadly, where we are looking at, so what you just saw as an illustration earlier with the nuclear waveforms and the way waveforms transform and energy stage change. This is something we didn't do just as a qualitative illustration, but we actually worked with the literature and with the accepted Schrödinger equations that describe these kind of waveforms. And here you see as an excerpt from our New Journal of Physics paper, the helium-4 waveform in the femtometer range, and then the nuclear wave function. So the helium-4 nuclear wave function, and then the D2 nuclear wave function, which is of course in the picometer, in the sort of 74 picometer range. And we can then also illustrate kind of this state transition, because what this represents is really the probability density, the probability of finding nucleons at different positions in space. And then this is the transition, the spontaneous fusion transition from D2 to helium-4, basically illustrated, which has been calculated by Kunin and Naunberg. So that process of actually finding the 4 nucleons in the compact helium-4 configuration, that would take a very long time. The rate is 10 to the minus 64 per second per deuteron pair that they estimated. But then, we have also created some simple models that illustrate these kinds of quantum dynamics. So if you have a tunneling out of a barrier, so this is very pedagogical, but then you get this exponential pattern. So where does this exponential decay come from? It comes from these kinds of particle in the box and tunneling considerations. And so this is simply with a single deuteron pair kind of leaking out, having its wave function leaking out and eventually emitting the energy difference that holds it back from being in the ground state. And then if we provide a resonant receiver state as a receptacle of that energy or probability density, then you get a faster decline, and you, instead of getting a exponential decay of the probability, you get an oscillation, and eventually the thing turns back, and you have Rabi oscillations until the coupling between the two systems breaks. And so here you could simply see how that de facto means an acceleration of the state transition. In this simple, like, sort of toy example, you can all find this on our GitHub, where you can also find the earlier material science illustrations. And then what this means in terms of Peter Hagelstein's approach of nuclear excitation transfer as an explanation of the variety of outcomes. So you have a coupling between a D2 system and then here an exemplary lattice nucleus, here a hypothetical palladium isotope that can absorb this energy resonantly. In reality, things are a bit more complicated, and then decay through incoherent emission in this case, but there are other dynamics as well that are more complicated. In reality, things are also a bit more complicated in the sense that there is unlikely to be a single nucleus that can resonantly absorb this energy, but a combination of them, as we have shown in our paper, leads to a very high density of states in the relevant energy region. And so then the response to the variety of reported outcomes is to say there is nuclear excitation transfer provides us a single model. It kind of drops out automatically the different outcomes, including nuclear particle emission, such as neutron, alpha emission, proton emission, and light element formation as a more symmetric type of breakup of the receiver nuclei. When this coupling is stronger, you can have multiple D2 systems transfer energy, therefore get into the 40 to 50 MeV range that Konrad recently mentioned as a precondition for fission reactions to occur and account for these lighter elements. And then if the coupling is even stronger, you can get excitation of lattice oscillatory modes, which then is our interpretation of excess heat reports. And so what we're looking at here, we're looking at different outcomes as a function of different operating regimes of the same kind of mechanism. With different variations of the same kind of mechanism, and so, but this is also, there's some interesting point here, because that basically means in Peter Hagelstein's picture, the experiments where you get nuclear particle emission are the ones where the most moderate coupling is required, and so these are in a sense the most benign kind of conditions to do experiments exhibiting anomalies. And the conceptual complexity in terms of the modeling is comparatively moderate, especially in comparison to the working on and explaining the excess heat results. And it also happens to be the case that the intrinsic ambiguity of nuclear particle measurements is lower than with excess heat. So there are many factors that speak in favor of focusing on nuclear particle emission as the observable of choice in order to break that stalemate, in order to initiate that phase change. And then we are not against working on excess heat results and working on this later, but we think that it's not the most suitable observable at this point in time for what's needed. So then we work on curating the empirical literature for our own sake, but also maybe for the sake of the community or for people who want to learn more about this, because there is a need to curate and focus. So if you have interested people that come into this field, and they get overwhelmed when they see the list of 1,000 plus papers, and they need a starting place. And ideally, there would be a single one-stop paper, but there isn't. But we can maybe curate a smaller list of some of the most convincing evidence to date. And what we created this interface to explore the LENR literature, so you can all access this at lenr.mit.edu/literature, and basically allows you on the left to filter both first by document type, also by publication venue, but then also by sample material, sample shapes, the type of hydrogen loading, the type of stimulation, the type of diagnostics used, and the type of anomalies claimed. And in the center, you get the matching papers, and you can click on them, and then we use AI to extract from each paper in a structured way the materials used, including with quotes from the papers that sort of support that assessment by the AI of the paper. So it's a very efficient way to quickly zoom through a section, to identify a particular section of the LENR literature, and then to very quickly sort of get on top of it and understand what were the papers. So these are the different filters that you can try out yourself. Here I'm just sort of showcasing this a little bit by, for instance, focusing just, pulling out gas loading papers, so just focusing on hydrogen loading and leaving all materials and all sample shapes in the mix, but just extracting, filtering for gas loading. And then also I did the same for other loading methods. And so you'll see the results of that in a second. But here our view is that, for the sake of really convincing a larger scientific community, electrochemistry is viewed as complicated and hard to reproduce in comparison to gas loading and ion beam setups that are viewed as more standard and are conceptually more simple for many. This is not, I'm not saying this is maybe a good thing. This is purely an arbitrary kind of way scientific communities evolved. But I think it can be supported by by feedback that we're getting, and that I'm sure some of you have been getting. And then similarly on the diagnostic sides, what we've heard is, the kind of feedback we've gotten is calorimetry is prone to systematic errors and unfamiliar to many scientists today, especially those who need to make decisions about funding, for instance, and the potential for unambiguous results and multimodal detection of the same observables is possible with these nuclear particle detection methods. So our identified parameter space is to work with gas loading and ion beam setups, and we'll focus on nuclear particle detection as primary diagnostic. And so if we then go through the literature, the 2,350 papers after some filtering of duplicates and so forth on LENR Canner, the PDFs, we can take out for now the review papers and theoretical papers. We're left with about 1,200 experimental papers. About 150 of these claim no anomalies. We take those out. Then there are a couple of exotic papers that, for instance, work with liquids only. So we take those out because they're kind of non-standard. And then we end up with about 1,000 generic LENR experiments. And if we adjust the zooming here, then we can break them into the different type of loading methods that were used. We can also break them into the different type of diagnostics that were used, calorimetry, nuclear particle detection, or both or neither. And you see most papers included either one of those two major approaches. And then we can break it out across loading methods again, and we can see, so, as you would expect, most papers involve electrolysis and calorimetry, but really the parameter space we think is going to be critical in causing that phase change is this parameter space in the middle of gas loading and ion bombardment experiments with nuclear particle detection as a primary diagnostic. And then also just in terms of the materials used, so most of those use palladium or titanium samples. And so we can stack that back together, and we find, if we then say we want to identify a short list of some of the strongest experiments in that category, that we were aiming for about 20 papers to shortlist here, so that would be about 2% of the total experimental literature then. So I think it's important. We need to curate. We don't need 10, 20, 30 more papers that are short and that are kind of flawed, but we need a few papers that somebody can read in an afternoon and walk away and be stunned. Then we need to upgrade experimental reports. So we think that to cause that sought phase change, we need multimodal nuclear particle detection and always full release of data, surface analysis with a mental and isotopic analysis with full sample before and after images. This has been mentioned also about, demonstrate the uncertainty and calibration of the detectors, show error bars, and just generally comprehensive data of the entire setup and full release of the full experimental configuration so that other people can look at it and replicate it if wanted. And so just giving a few examples, oftentimes in papers to date, there's only a sort of small segments of the sample shown after the experiment, and it's not clear how these were selected and why that region and what other regions look like and so forth. So we argue we need to have full sample scans with before and after sample scans. Then also for nuclear particle emission, often just counts are mentioned or even just the mention of a burst, but what we need is full waveform recording. Every single count needs to be recorded by its waveform and then also looked at whether that waveform is actually corresponding to the characteristic waveform for nuclear particles. And I can show a little bit later what for instance, fake bursts look like through noise. And then the papers basically generally need to be longer. So here's a histogram of the page lengths of these 1,000 experimental papers. The median page length is 10 pages. If you remove the title and abstract and citations, you have 8-9 pages. That's not enough for a field that's so fundamental and critical and eyed critically as ours. So the papers should be, with including appendices, more like 40-50 pages with a very detailed documentation. And so to summarize, what's needed towards a phase change is to be strategic and what kind of intervention is impactful, identify the corresponding parameter space, identify the strongest experiments to date, and understand how they have been falling short, then upgrade them and explain them. Okay, I'm going to spend a few more minutes to go through our experimental platform that aims to accommodate that. So I'm going to go a few minutes into the Q&A session, but find me after or email me to discuss more. So this is our chamber overview. We have a lot of this already on on GitHub, and what's not there will be there, and you can also have a closer look at the recording of this. But then the basic setup is fairly simple, with connecting a chamber to a gas manifold for pressurizing and evacuating, and then we have these reconfigurable chamber internals that can accommodate, in this case, these 4 groups of experiments, but we designed this setup to accommodate many more families of experiments in that parameter space of gas loading experiments in particular. So here you see an example of what these internals look like. Here's another one with an internal plate heater. Here's another one with an internal annular heater for sample pellets and Chetkov type of experiments. We have full recording 24/7 of all sensors and also all power supply inputs, for instance, for the heaters. We've demonstrated kind of leak tightness and performance based on the specs of the components used. Every chamber lives on a station that runs 24/7, has an uninterruptible power supply, and streams data to a cloud-based database constantly, even when there's no experiments running. So we can always have a baseline and background data. Here's the sort of loading and evacuating station that can be connected to and detached from. Here's some of the chambers in action. And then we have this cloud-based database where you can access all sensor data in real time and time synchronized. Here's some heater and temperature data. Then we have corresponding counts of here different types of a neutron detector next to the experiment and a background one, and also helium-3 detectors, sodium iodide gamma detectors with also the spectrum extracted. And then again, this is just sort of a high-level real-time overview, but we do save the waveforms for every single count, and we can go back and identify the waveforms for any count here within a few minutes. We put our analysis on our GitHub. Here's an example of a computational notebook that shows the loading of a titanium sample. You can look at this yourself, and then here we have these full surface sample scans where you can sort of zoom in. This has been inspired by tools that are used at TTU, but then we developed our own based on open source software. You can look at this yourself and kind of zoom in and explore a sample. Then we have feature detection, SEM methods, and then also you can sort of get a real-time SEM spectrum for any kind of quadrant here in this sample, and then again before and after experiments. These are our detectors, different types of X-ray, gamma, and neutron detectors, digitizers, detectors with foils, and again, for every detector, there's a spectrum taken every minute, and then real-time extraction of the peak heights. So I'm going to jump ahead here. These are the liquid scintillation detectors with a separation of gammas and neutrons. And I'll be just one more minute. And then the demonstration of the detector efficiency, total efficiency and intrinsic efficiency. We have here 35 days of detector background to establish a baseline, and sort of we see that we have very consistent background over the entire 35 days. So this is the normalized frequency of counts per minute, and so that's the background, the baseline against which any kind of result will have to be compared. And then here's an example of over the entire 35-day period, we had two what looked like bursts, but so I showed you the bursts on the left, but then when we look at the waveforms, these were actually noise instances, and we have to work on the mechanics. There was a mechanical disruption of one of the cables, and so that's the kind of stuff we need to proactively guard against and be proactive in any publication to say that we have taken this into account and we have excluded that possibility. Okay, so I conclude. We argue that a phase change can be brought about in LENR research when employing the right strategies. We work to contextualize, explain, curate, and upgrade LENR experiments, and we created a platform that can cover that part of the parameter space that we identified, and we call for everyone here to collaborate with us and or help us identify the experiments we should do to maximize the chances of making this phase change happen. Thank you.